Until war is constitutionally declared, the nation and all its members must observe and preserve peace. That's from John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States. Unfortunately, though, today, few people, if any, even understand what any of this means, or how the founders, including Presidents Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, put these principles into practice. So on this episode, we're going to shatter 3 of the biggest modern myths about war powers and the Constitution. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, February 7th, 2025. Let's get right to it with myth number 1. That only large-scale conflicts count as war, and everything else doesn't count as war, so therefore you don't have to get Congress involved. You can just have unilateral action by the executive branch. And here from Mike Meharry, he points out that today, most people think only an all-out war against another country counts as war under the Constitution. In their view, smaller-scale military operations fall short of the war threshold and therefore don't need congressional authorization. But unfortunately, all the government-run schools have propagandized with this kind of stuff. The supporters of the largest government in history have propagandized us with that kind of message for decades. But as constitutional scholar Rob Natelson noted, the founders didn't make this distinction at all. He wrote, "Founding-era dictionaries and other sources, both legal and lay, tell us that when the Constitution was approved, the word war was understood to consist of any hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition. A single cannonball, a shot, any kind of hostility from a sovereign over opposition was considered an act of war." A very typical dictionary definition of the time came from Barlow's dictionary of 1772-73. The exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. And even John Adams, during the height of the so-called quasi-war, they call it that today, the quasi-war with France, reinforced this understanding. There was already conflict going on the seas, and in an 1800 letter to future Chief Justice John Marshall, Adams made it clear. He put it like this: questions of consequence. This is in September of 1800. So he's wondering, where's this going to go? Should I hit up Congress for a declaration of war, even though we're already at conflict? They've already authorized me to do some stuff? Here's how he put it: questions of consequence will arise, and among others, whether the president ought not, at the opening of the session, to recommend to Congress an immediate and general declaration of war against the French Republic. So this is a question. He's wondering, should I go for this approach? Congress, he said, has already, in my judgment, as well as in the opinion of the judges at Philadelphia, declared war within the meaning of the Constitution against that republic under certain restrictions and limitations. They never issued a declaration of war, a formal text that said, we are declaring war against France. But they certainly authorized President Adams to take some offensive measures, not just repel attacks, to take some offensive measures. And for him, he was viewing this, he's far from alone on this, we'll get to others, that this was an act of war, an act of using the declare war powers by Congress, just that they restricted him rather than giving him an open-ended declaration of war, which would allow him to do basically whatever he wanted. Well, not whatever he wanted. He said, if war in any degree is to be continued, it is a serious question whether it will not be better to take off all the restrictions and limitations. So a declaration of war without any restrictions is just that. Exercising the declare war power but giving limitations is also done through statute, but under the same part of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, I believe it's Clause 11, the power to declare war under the Constitution. So, in other words, some key points here. Congress already authorized offensive military actions, but they gave them limits. This was still using the power to declare war. And despite not issuing this full-scale declaration of war, President Adams himself considered the conflict a war under the war powers of the Constitution, and Congress had exercised those powers. And if he wanted to expand that war or expand his powers to prosecute that war, he needed additional congressional approval to remove the limits they had given him. So the key takeaway on myth number 1 is that the founders considered any hostilities like this, big or small, to be war, and offensive measures, which we'll get to in a moment, required Congress to authorize it. So that brings us to myth number 2. The view that once there's an attack, the president can basically do anything unilaterally to respond within certain limits, I guess, but Congress has no say. It doesn't need Congress, doesn't have to ask any permission, nothing. He can do a real good offense as the best defense, things like this. But George Washington, among others, made it very clear that the president could only take defensive measures even when under attack and even when the attackers issued a formal declaration of war on the United States. So there's already a state of war on the other side. There's already a conflict happening. But President Washington himself, and this is the same view that Adams, Jefferson, and Madison took, was that you had to defer to Congress in order to get approval for offensive measures. And he repeatedly did this as president, where he continually deferred to Congress for any offensive expeditions. Here, for example, from an article that I wrote, I'm not sure exactly when, but on September 26, 1792, Tennessee Governor William Blount, I should pull this up on the screen, sent a letter to Washington's Secretary of War, General Henry Knox, informing him that, quote, 5 lower towns of the Cherokees have declared war against the United States. A formal declaration of war while there was a conflict, some skirmishes going on the frontiers had happened. So the Cherokees declared war on the United States. And in another letter to Knox, the governor wrote, "This declaration of war was very unexpected and has given great alarm to the frontiers. Indeed, I do not find that anything of the kind has ever before been done by Indians in so formal a manner." It was very clear. Knox understood it. Blount understood it. George Washington was quickly informed of what was going on. Everyone knew that there was fighting happening. Everyone knew that there was a conflict happening and that the Cherokee had declared war on the United States. So Knox quickly organized a meeting with Secretary of the State, Thomas Jefferson, and Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. We know of them being at odds on almost everything. But check this out. He said, "I've consulted with them on this disagreeable affair." This is his message to George Washington. "Our unanimous opinion is that as Governor Blount has been furnished heretofore with the most ample powers to draw for the militia of his government for its defensive protection, that all measures of an offensive nature be restrained until the meeting of Congress to whom belong the powers of war." So even though war was declared on the United States, even though there was fighting already happening, they could still only go to the line of defense, repel attacks, and that's it, because the powers of war belong to Congress. Knox then informed Governor Blount, under instruction from George Washington, that he could deal with incursions into his territory only, and could only take defensive measures. Further action could only be taken under the authorization of Congress. Here's from his letter to the governor. "As you have ample powers to call forth such portions of the militia of your government for its defensive protection as you shall judge occasions to require, no further steps can be taken at this moment." Now, Washington went to get offensive authorization for offensive measures. He wasn't giving them right away. And the governor in Tennessee just kept saying, "Hey, I need this. Can I do this?" And Knox repeatedly told him, "Look, no, the president tells me you cannot do this. You have to keep it at the line of defense. Period. End of story." There was already a war declared. And then, Washington kept asking, and he finally did get approval, but he only went on offensive expeditions or measures once he got that authorization from Congress. Here in his 5th annual message to Congress, this is December of 1793, President Washington addressed ongoing conflicts with both the Creek and the Cherokee nations, noting that offensive measures or offensive actions against them were prohibited. He made it clear in his message to Congress that offensive measures were prohibited during the recess of Congress. He says offensive measures against them prohibited during the recess of Congress, because it is with Congress to pronounce what shall be done. Let's also look briefly at Thomas Jefferson, because in May of 1801, and Thomas Jefferson versus the Barbary Pirates is almost always the one that the propagandists and the people who have only learned from the propagandists always bring up. Thomas Jefferson went to war with the Barbary Pirates, we hear all the time, without even getting anything from Congress. But you could only say that if you know nothing about the history. Of course, all these source documents and articles that I'm mentioning will be in the show notes so you can read and learn the full story. I'm just giving you some brief highlights here. So it's May of 1801. Jefferson is just barely in office. United States ships were already under attack by the Barbary pirates, Tripoli, the Pasha Bay of Tripoli. And so Thomas Jefferson and his cabinet discussed their options to respond under the Constitution. And here from the article, in attendance were Attorney General Levi Lincoln, Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin, Secretary of State James Madison, father of the Constitution guy, and Acting Secretary of the Navy Samuel Smith. The entire cabinet agreed that they could set sail, send ships out, and if war was declared on the United States, they could use defensive measures. They couldn't go on the offensive. They couldn't go land troops and take over the country. They could only fight back and kind of defend the shipping lanes. Levi Lincoln, that's the Attorney General, his position was the most reserved. He said, "Our men of war may repel an attack on individual vessels, but after the repulse, may not proceed to destroy the enemy's vessels generally." Not everybody agreed with him, but if you want to get an understanding of how restrictive Thomas Jefferson and his cabinet, their views were on war powers, even if war was declared, and on top of it, they were attacking a U.S. ship, he took the position that you couldn't even destroy the ship. You could just fight it off until it stopped. Now, if you happened to destroy it, that was the only way to stop it from attacking. That's one thing, but you couldn't go there once the battle was over and then sink the ship and take people captive. No, not at all. And Jefferson actually took some notes in his cabinet meeting. This is May 15th, 1801. He said, "Whether the captains may be authorized, if war exists, to search for and destroy the enemy's vessels wherever they can find them. All except Mr. Lincoln agree. M, G, and S think they may pursue into the harbors, but Madison says that they may not enter, but in pursuit." So again, some differences of opinion on how far they could go, but all of them were way more restrictive on what could be done, even in response to an attack, even in response to an attack under a declaration of war against the United States, than almost anyone today. So despite all of that, Jefferson still refused to authorize any offensive action without getting approval from Congress. So they set sail with some instructions with this naval squadron on May 20th, so like a week later. And they were going to patrol the area defensively to protect ships and also offer peace to Tripoli. Now, Jefferson even sent the squadron out with instructions on how to respond just in case there was this official declaration of war. He said, should the Bay of Tripoli have declared war, as he has threatened, against the United States, you will then proceed direct to that port, where you will lay your ships in such a position as effectually to prevent any of their vessels from going in or out. So at best you could do, if they declare war on us, is run a blockade. You can't attack their cities. You can't land armed forces. You can't invade, none of that stuff. This is as far as you can go. So the key takeaway, repelling an attack is not the same as waging war. Only Congress can decide when the United States moves from defensive measures to offensive measures. And as I've mentioned already, all this stuff that I'm citing in this episode, I've got a number of articles on this, plus a bunch of original source documents. These will all be included in the show notes blog for this episode, which we published for every episode. Alan Mosley gets it organized, and you'll find all the reference links, generally in order of how I'm going through them in the episode. And I will get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out a couple of hours after this live stream is done. So again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And again, I am barely scratching the surface. There's a lot of detailed history here, especially if you want to learn. We've got a bunch of articles on Madison, Adams, Jefferson, and Washington on how they actually used their powers of war under the Constitution and how they viewed things and how they kept going to Congress to get approval, even in situations where war had been declared on the United States and they were under attack. So let's get to myth number 3, that the president can unilaterally take any offensive military action without approval from Congress in any situation. And that, for the founders, that was a never, ever, ever could happen. Here's James Madison in Helvidius number 1. This is August of 1793. He says, the natural province of the executive magistrate is to execute laws, as that of the legislature is to make laws. All his acts, therefore, properly executive, must presuppose the existence of the laws to be executed. So the power to declare war, however they do it, whether they do an open-ended declaration of war or they have limited hostilities authorized, this is a legislative function. This is not an executive function. He said a declaration that there shall be war is not an execution of laws. It does not suppose pre-existing laws to be executed. It is not in any respect an act merely executive. So in no situation for James Madison, the father of the Constitution, is this decision an executive decision. It is always legislative. He said it is, on the contrary, one of the most deliberative acts that can be performed, and when performed has the effect of repealing all the laws operating in a state of peace so far as they are inconsistent with a state of war, and of enacting as a rule for the executive a new code adapted to the relation between the society and its foreign enemy. Now, again, during the Barbary conflict, this is back to Madison one more time. This is Helvidius, his second paper in 1793. He said, then the declaring of war is expressly made a legislative function. It was intentionally done this by the founding generation. He said, the judging of the obligations to make war is admitted to be included as a legislative function. Whenever then a question occurs whether war shall be declared or whether public stipulations require it, the question necessarily belongs to the department to which those functions belong, and no other department can be in the execution of its proper functions if it should undertake to decide such a question. I guess an alternative name for myth number 3 is that Congress cannot, or the myth is that Congress can just pass the buck and authorize the executive branch to make a decision of whether or not military force was going to be used against a various group, a country, or whatever, because that's how it has played out for many, many decades today. The president can never do this under the structure of the Constitution here as James Madison described it. Now back to Thomas Jefferson during that Barbary conflict. Here he is. We're getting into late 1801. Tripoli had already declared war. This was May 14th, I think, 1801. There was already a naval battle over the summer. There was ongoing attacks on U.S. shipping. And Jefferson still held the view that he was, quote, unauthorized by the Constitution without the sanction of Congress to go beyond the line of defense. And only after requesting, and here's from my article on Jefferson versus the Barbary Pirates, and eventually receiving this authorization for offensive war measures from Congress, did President Jefferson order the Navy to take such actions. And on February 18th, 1802, Jefferson then sent a circular to naval commanders with instructions on what they were authorized to do. So it was in his first annual message to Congress December of 1801, he pointed out, like, even though all this stuff is happening, I'm unauthorized by the Constitution to go beyond the line of defense. So will you guys give me this? We need it. He wasn't just saying, I don't want to fight back. He was asking for permission from the representatives of the people. That's the House of Representatives, and the representatives of the states. Well, at least at the time, before the 17th Amendment, that was the Senate. So that was in his annual message to Congress that he requested that. And in February, it took a couple of months, Congress finally gave him the approval. And that was when, just less than 2 weeks later, he sent out this circular to the naval commander saying, quote, therefore, and in pursuance of the said statute, you are hereby authorized and directed to subdue, seize, and make prize of all vessels, goods, and effects belonging to the Bay of Tripoli or to his subjects, and to bring or send the same into port to be proceeded against and distributed according to law. On and on and on. So basically, Jefferson got some limited approval to fight back offensively rather than just fighting them off defensively. And then he continually, over the next couple of years, kept requesting permission and authorization from Congress, and then sometimes Congress was quick, sometimes they were not. Here again in 1805, he said, considering that Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war, I have thought it my duty to await their authority for using force in any degree which could be avoided. This is a message to Congress in December of 1805. Again, Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war. If you think about it, the founding generation didn't want this decision to be in the hands of a single person. That was what the king had. And they did not want a monarchy. They wanted a system where ultimately the people had the final say on these types of things through their representatives of the people. And also it was a union of states. So the states had to have a say on this as well. And if another nation attacks you and a single dude makes that choice, maybe he wants to go obliterate the entire country, but the people are like, hey, let's see if we can work this out. Let's do something small. And that's the whole situation, because they never, ever, ever wanted a monarchical system. Even Hamilton, who probably pined for it, argued against this type of thing for war powers under the president, under the Constitution. So Congress alone is constitutionally invested with the power of changing our condition from peace to war. He said, I have barely instructed the officers stationed in the neighborhood of the aggressions to protect our citizens from violence, to patrol within the borders actually delivered to us, and not to go out of them, but when necessary to repel an inroad or to rescue a citizen or his property. So very, very limited was Thomas Jefferson's response, despite all the propaganda telling us that Jefferson set the foundation for modern unilateral executive war powers. This is absolutely absurd. And I think the key takeaway here, the president never, ever has the unilateral power to take offensive military action. Only Congress, under the Constitution, has the power to determine when we're going to go from defensive measures to offensive. And when you get down to it, the Constitution's limits on war powers weren't just theoretical. They weren't just philosophical. They were strictly followed by the first four presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. And if there was going to be an offensive military action, it required approval from Congress, period. And I've got a reading list that I think is really, really important for you to check out if you want to learn more. First of all, let me pull this one up on the screen. War Powers, the True History of George Washington and the Indian Tribes. President Washington, I think, might be the best example of this. He was denied authorization from Congress to go on the offense, and he told his people, you can't do it until I get approval. And then once he got that approval, he went on the offense. Then we have War Powers, the True History of John Adams and the so-called Quasi-War with France. Here from the article, during America's quasi-war with France, President Adams asked Congress for permission to take offensive military actions on multiple occasions, and in order to stay within the bounds of the Constitution's war powers, he closely followed those limitations and boundaries that Congress set. And here, from the next article, War Powers, the True History of James Madison, the Constitution, and the War of 1812, it's even more amazing how Madison did this. Madison took no offensive military action against the British, despite him going to Congress and saying that Britain was already engaged in war, had already declared war in action against the United States. Instead, he insisted, quote, whether the United States shall continue passive under these progressive usurpations and these accumulating wrongs, or opposing force to force in defense of their national rights, shall commit a just cause into the hands of the almighty disposer of events, is a solemn question which the Constitution wisely confides to the legislative department of the government. So Great Britain was already on the offensive. And even in that scenario, James Madison saying, look, if it's up to the people and the states to make a determination if we're going to go into a full-scale war with Great Britain. And here Mike Meharry writes, Madison emphatically placed the decision exclusively in the hands of Congress and made it clear he would abide by its decision. He said, in recommending it to their early deliberations, I am happy in the assurance that the decision will be worthy the enlightened and patriotic counsels of a virtuous, a free, and a powerful nation. And I think one of the most important articles of this group is the true history of Thomas Jefferson versus the Barbary pirates. Because even after U.S. ships had been attacked and Tripoli declared war, Jefferson refused to take offensive action without congressional approval and repeatedly went back to Congress when he needed more. And these historical events from the article reveal that Thomas Jefferson's true view on war powers under the Constitution include three main points. One, Congress exclusively decides whether or not the country will engage in war, not the president. Two, the president can use the military to respond to attacks, but cannot go beyond the line of defense. Three, even if war is declared by a nation against the United States, the president cannot go beyond the line of defense and must get authorization from Congress to engage in measures of offense. And really, Jefferson is not unique on this because Washington, Adams, and Madison also took the exact same approach. Even Alexander Hamilton got in on this, writing as Pacificus in June of 1793. He said, if the legislature have a right to make war on the one hand, it is on the other the duty of the executive to preserve peace till war is declared. And of course, we have that great quote from John Jay right at the beginning, until war is constitutionally declared, the nation and all its members must observe and preserve peace. There is absolutely nothing that helps us reach and teach more and more people every single day about these essential foundational principles about the Constitution and war powers and so much more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you support the work we're doing, you want to help us continue and expand, please consider joining us today. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, our membership program starts out at just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You can also go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. If you don't want to be a member of anybody, but you still want to pitch in financially, whatever works best for you works best for me. I'm grateful for any consideration you can give to putting your financial faith behind our work today. And then if you're not able to do that, or you're not willing or not interested, that's cool too. I'm glad you're here. The fact that you're here and interested in learning this stuff is really so important because we're not taught about any of this in government-run schools. And, you can still help us spread the word. There's a number of free and easy peasy things that you could do, like hitting the like button, subscribing, getting notifications, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, a lot of watch time percentage on YouTube. The more you watch, the more likely the algorithm will show us to more people. I'm very grateful for your help. I really appreciate you being here today. I hope this was interesting. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. I'm going to be off next week, Monday, because I got family coming in this weekend, but I look forward to seeing you later next week here on the Path to Liberty.